Chapter 22. Sammy Jay becomes curious. Learn all you can about others, but keep your own affairs to yourself. Peter Rabbit. Of course, it was Sammy Jay who first found out that Peter Rabbit was back in the dear Old Briar patch. Sammy took it into his head to fly over there the very morning of Peter's homecoming. Indeed, little Miss Fuzzytail hadn't had time to half see the dear Old Briar patch, which, was to be her new home, when Peter saw Sammy Jay coming. Now, Peter was not quite ready to have all the world know that there was a Mrs. Peter, for of course that was what little Miss Fuzzytail was now that she had come to make her home with Peter. They wanted to keep by themselves for a little while and just be happy with each other. So as soon as Peter saw Sammy Jay headed toward the old briar patch, he hid little Miss Fuzzytail under the thickest sweet briar bush and then hurried out to the nearest sweet clover patch. Of course, Sammy Jay saw him right away, and of course, Sammy was very much surprised. "Hello, Peter Rabbit! Where'd you come from?" he shouted, as he settled himself comfortably in a little poplar tree growing on the edge of the old briar patch. "Oh," said Peter with a very grand air, "I've been on a long journey to see the great world." "Which means," said Sammy Jay with a chuckle, "that you've been in the pasture all this time. And let me tell you, Peter Rabbit, the old pasture is a very small part of the great world. By the way, Tommy Tit the Chickadee was down here the other day and told us all about you. He said that you had fallen in love with little Miss Fuzzytail, and he guessed that you were going to make your home up there. What's the matter? Did her father, old Jed Thumper, drive you out?" "No, he didn't," snapped Peter angrily. "It's none of your business what I came home for, Sammy Jay, but I'll tell you just the same. I came home because I wanted to." Sammy chuckled, for he dearly loves to tease Peter and make him angry. Then the imp of mischief, who seems always to live just under that smart cap of Sammy's, prompted him to ask, "Did you come home alone?" Now Peter couldn't say yes, for that would be an untruth, and whatever faults Peter may have, he is at least truthful. So he just pretended not to have heard Sammy's question. Now, when Sammy had asked the question, he had thought nothing about it. It had just popped into his head by way of something to say. But Sammy Jay is sharp, and he noticed right away that Peter didn't answer, but began to talk about other things. "Ha ha!" thought Sammy to himself. "I believe he didn't come alone. I wonder now if he brought Miss Fuzzytail with him." Right away, Sammy began to peer down into the old briar patch, twisting and turning so that he could see in every direction, and all the time talking as fast as his tongue could go. 2 or 3 times he flew out over the old briar patch, pretending to try to catch moths, but really so that he could look down into certain hiding places. The last time that he did this, he spied little Mrs. Peter, who was, Miss Fuzzytail. At once Sammy Jay started for the Green Forest, screaming at the top of his voice, "Peter Rabbit's married! Peter Rabbit's married!" Chapter 23. Peter Introduces Mrs. Peter. It's not what you do for others, not what they do for you, that makes you feel so happy all through and through and through. Peter Rabbit. Peter Rabbit made a wry face as he listened to Sammy Jay shrieking at the top of his voice as he flew through the Green Forest and over the Green Meadows. "Peter Rabbit's married! Peter Rabbit's married!" He saw the Merry Little Breezes, who, are the little children of Old Mother West Wind, start for the dear Old Briar patch as soon as they heard Sammy Jay, and he knew that they would be only the first of a lot of visitors. He hurried to where Mrs. Peter was hiding under a sweetbrier bush. "Do you hear what that mischief maker Sammy Jay is screaming?" asked Peter. Mrs. Peter nodded. Don't you think it sounds kind of nice, Peter?" she asked in a bashful sort of way. Peter chuckled. "It sounds more like kind of nice, more than kind of nice to me," said he. "Do you know, I used to think that Sammy Jay never did and never could say anything nice, but I've just changed my mind. Though he isn't saying it to be nice, it really is the nicest thing I've ever heard him say. We haven't been able to keep our secret, so I think the very best thing we can do is invite everybody to call. Then we can get it over with and have a little time to ourselves. Here come the Merry Little Breezes, and I know that they will be glad to take the invitations for us." Mrs. Peter agreed, for she thought that anything Peter did or suggested was just about right. So the Merry Little Breezes were soon skipping and dancing all over the Green Meadows and through the Green Forest with this message: "Mr. and Mrs. Peter Rabbit will be at home in the Old Briar-patch to their friends tomorrow afternoon at shadow time." "Why did you make it at shadow time?" asked Mrs. Peter. "Because that will give all of our friends a chance to come," replied Peter. "Those who sleep through the day will have waked up, and those who sleep through the night will not have gone to bed. Besides, it will be safer for some of the smallest of them if the black shadows are about for them to hide in on their way here." "How thoughtful you are," said little Mrs. Peter with a little sigh of happiness. Of course, everyone who could walk, creep, or fly headed for the Old Briar-patch the next day at shadow time, for almost everyone knows and loves Peter Rabbit. And of course, everyone was very anxious to meet Mrs. Peter. From the Smiling Pool came Billy Mink, Little Joe Otter, Jerry Muskrat, Spotty the Turtle, and Old Grandfather Frog. From the Green Forest came Bobby Coon, Unc' Billy Possum, and Mrs. Possum, Prickly Porky the Porcupine, Whitefoot the Wood Mouse, Happy Jack the Gray Squirrel, Chatterer the Red Squirrel, Blacky the Crow, Sammy Jay, Old Mr. Buzzard, Mr. Mockingbird, and Sticky Toes the Tree Toad. From the Green Meadows came Danny Meadow Mouse, Old Mr. Toad, Digger the Badger, Jimmy Skunk, and Striped Chipmunk, who lives near the old stone wall between the edge of the Green Meadows and the Green Forest. Johnny and Polly Chuck came down from the old orchard, and Drummer the Woodpecker came from the same place. Of course, Old Man Coyote paid his respects, and when he came, everybody but Prickly Porky and Digger the Badger and Jimmy the Skunk made way for him with great respect. Granny and Reddy Fox and Hooty the Owl didn't call, but they sat where they could look on and make fun. You see, Peter had fooled all three so many times that they felt none too friendly. Very proud looked Peter as he stood under a bramble bush with Mrs. Peter by his side and introduced her to his many friends. And very sweet and modest and retiring looked little Mrs. Peter as she sat beside him. Everybody said that she was too sweet for anything, and when Reddy Fox overheard that remark he grinned and said, "Not for me. She can't be too sweet for me, and I hope I'll have a chance to find out just how sweet she is." What do you suppose he meant? Chapter 14. Danny Meadow Mouse Warns Peter Rabbit. Good advice is always needed, but alas is seldom heeded. Peter Rabbit. Danny Meadow Mouse waited until all the rest of Peter Rabbit's friend had left the Old Briar-patch after paying their respects to Peter and Mrs. Peter. He waited for two reasons, did Danny Meadow Mouse. In the first place, he had seen old Granny Fox and Reddy Fox hanging about a little way off, and though they had disappeared after a while, Danny had an idea that they were not far away, but were hiding so that they might catch him on his way home. Of course, he hadn't the slightest intention of giving them the chance. He had made up his mind to ask Peter if he might spend the night in a corner of the Old Briar-patch, and he was very sure that Peter would say he might, for he and Peter are very good friends indeed. The second good reason Danny had for waiting was this very friendship. You see, Peter had been away from the Green Meadows so long, Danny felt sure he couldn't know all about how things were there now, so he wanted to warn Peter that the Green Meadows were not nearly as safe as before Old Man Coyote had come there to live. So Danny waited, and when all the rest of the callers had left, he called Peter to one side where little Mrs. Peter couldn't hear. Danny stood up on his hind legs so as to whisper in one of Peter's ears. "Do you know that Old Man Coyote is the most dangerous enemy we have, Peter Rabbit? Do you know that?" he asked. Peter Rabbit shook his head. "I don't believe that, Danny," said he. "His terrible voice has frightened you so that you just think of him as bad as he sounds. Why, Old Man Coyote is a friend of mine." Then he told Danny how Old Man Coyote had done him a good turn in the Old Pasture in return for a good turn Peter had once done him, and how he said that he always pays his debts. Danny Meadow Mouse looked doubtful. "What else did he say?" he demanded. "Nothing except that we're even now," replied Peter. "Ha!" said Danny Meadow Mouse. The way he said it made Peter turn to look at him sharply. "Ha!" said Danny again. "If you're even, why don't you owe him anything and he doesn't owe you anything? Watch out, Peter Rabbit. Watch out! I would stick pretty close to the Old Briar patch with Mrs. Peter if I were you. I would indeed. You used to think old Granny Fox pretty smart, but Old Man Coyote is smarter. Yes, sir, he is smarter. And every one of the rest of us has got to be smarter than ever before to keep out of his clutches. Watch out, Peter Rabbit. If you and Old Man Coyote are even, now, if you don't mind, I'll curl up in my old hiding place for the night. I really don't dare go back home tonight." Of course, Peter told Danny Meadow Mouse that he was welcome to spend the night in the Old Briar patch, and thanked Danny for his warning as he bade him good night. But Peter never carries his troubles with him for long, and by the time he had rejoined little Miss Peter, he was very much inclined to laugh at Danny's fear. "What did that funny little Meadow Mouse have to say?" asked Mrs. Peter. Peter told her and then added, "But I don't believe we have anything to fear from Old Man Coyote. You know, he is my friend." "But I don't know that he is mine," replied little Mrs. Peter, and the way she said it made Peter look at her anxiously. "I believe Danny Meadow Mouse is right," she continued. "Oh, Peter, you will watch out, won't you?" And Peter promised her that he would.